Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Pfefferman, and I'm a park ranger at Gateway Arch National Park. Welcome to the 11th season of monthly Gateway to the Stars programming at the Gateway Arch. Usually we have a guest speaker or myself who does a national park or astronomy themed presentation in our theater or the education center. And then if skies are decently clear, we follow it with telescope viewing led by volunteers from the St. Louis Astronomical Society outside the Arch on the West Entrance Plaza. Programs are usually held from May through October each year. This year, as we all know, the world is different. The Gateway Arch Visitor Center is closed, and at least at the beginning of the summer, all programming will have to be virtual. Now, that's not all bad. An in-person presentation like we're about to have, featuring 4 different organizations, would be really difficult to put together. And of course, the telescope viewing historically is clouded out about 40% of the time. We'll be able to go ahead with tonight's program regardless of the weather, and there will be at least the possibility of getting a much larger audience than we would have had in person at the Gateway Arch. And besides, you don't have to worry about parking your car or feeding the meter and all those sorts of things. So we're going to try to make the best of it, and I think we've put together a very interesting program for you tonight. Now, as you know, national parks are special places that belong to everybody in the United States. They could be huge, beautiful natural areas like the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone. They could be historic sites or man-made national monuments like the Gateway Arch. But they all share a common mission, which is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. These resources and values are threatened by light pollution both inside and outside national parks. And so, to begin the first part of tonight's program, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Don Ficken.
Well, thank you, Rich. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I think we have 2 exciting programs. I'm president of the International Dark Sky Chapter of Missouri. I happen to be also an amateur astronomer, a longtime member of the St. Louis Astronomical Society and the Astronomical Society of Eastern Missouri. We've got 2 exciting programs tonight. The first program is called Lights Out St. Louis. It's presented by IDA Missouri with special guests from the St. Louis Audubon Society and the Audubon Center at Riverlands. And this program will focus on bird migration and how birds are harmed by light pollution as they migrate north and south. The second program will be actually a very fun program we're going to try. It's called Virtual Stargazing. We'll be literally looking at the stars through a piece of software that shows what we can actually see in the sky, and weather permitting, we'll have some live viewing of the moon, and I think we're going to have a good time with that. So many of you may or may not have participated in a webinar before, but how it works is that we can see and you can see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. We'll have a format for you to pose questions to us, and we'll be setting time aside for questions. And you'll be streaming from actually 2 different ways. You've got folks from Facebook you can actually enter questions into your Facebook page, or you can go to Zoom if you happen to be participating that way, and you can put questions in the Q&A box or comments in the chat box. We are going to hold questions until the end of the presentations just to keep things simple for us. So let's start with our first program. It's called Lights Out St. Louis, and this program is actually a collaboration of the St. Louis Audubon Society, the Audubon Center at Riverlands, and IDA Missouri. And we're going to first start with an introduction to light pollution, and then we're going to talk about what's called the Lights Out program. We've worked with a group, the National Audubon Society, to put together a really cool 10-minute video that will kind of give an understanding of what's happening nationally on the Lights Out program. And then we're going to dive into the St. Louis area with our bird experts, and we'll finish up this portion with a discussion about what you can do at home to actually be more light pollution friendly. and we'll end up with a question and answer period. So let's talk a little bit about the International Dark Sky Association. Many of you may or may not know about this organization. It's actually a global organization. It has chapters, 65 chapters throughout the world, 28 different countries, and it's really the recognized or the leading authority on light pollution. Our Missouri chapter is just a little over a year old. It's an official chapter of IDA. It's active throughout Missouri, and I know that we've got listeners probably from Kansas and maybe from Illinois on tonight, and we do reach across the border. They're not officially chapters in those states, so we're welcome to have you participate in our projects. You can visit our website. We've got a lot of active things going on. In fact, if you're interested, we have a presentation on June 16th on learning how to take photographs of the Milky Way, and one on June 19th, which is in collaboration with the St. Louis Astronomical Society, about the science of light pollution. We're putting sky meters throughout the state of Missouri to measure light pollution. I think you'll find both of those programs a lot of fun. So what is light pollution? It turns out there's really not a universal definition of light pollution. The best way we can describe it is any adverse effect or impact that's attributable to the use of artificial light at night. And sometimes folks refer that to what's called ALAN, A-L-A-N. So this is a really pretty photo. It's a photo from space looking at Earth. And hopefully you can see the lights. It's very nice, something people just love to look at. It's a marvel to see. But when you think about this in a different way, really what's happening is that the lights are shining into space, and it's a lot of wasted light. And as pretty as that looks, the trouble is that it's also a lot of wasted light. And our wildlife and our human health and others are impacted by this unused, this light that's basically wasted in being put up in the sky. So turns out that the light pollution is increasing 2.2% each year from the year 2012 to 2016. Today, 1/3 of mankind cannot see the Milky Way. And if you focus in on just the continental US and Europe, 99% of the people have some kind of impact of light pollution. And worldwide, it's 80% of all people. So most of us, when we think about light pollution, we think about stars. We think about, well, we're looking at stars, we can't see the stars anymore. And that's very true. We love white LED, by the way. We love LED lights. The trouble is that when we get really bright spectrums or get too much of it, it starts really dimming our ability to see the night sky. We call that contrast in astronomical terms. Whenever we look at stars, we want to have a good vivid background that's black with a very bright star so we can see the stars better. So what's very common, if I move this forward, is that we have what's called sky glow. When you have sky glow, that starts, and even in the deepest part of our state, for example, of Missouri, when you look off the horizon, usually you can see some type of sky glow somewhere. And that's just the concern right there. It's reaching even further and further out from the metro areas into the deep areas of our state. So there are many more reasons than just the night sky to think about light pollution. It's human health. Whenever we open up our cell phones that have the blue light, whatever else, those impact what's called melatonin, your ability to sleep. Light pollution wastes energy. In other words, we have to replace that with carbon-based trees type of things to take carbon out of the air. We have safety issues. And of course, wildlife is something that I've been personally learning a lot about. Is really a fascinating area. When you look at wildlife, in fact, light pollution is known to harm a vast array of species, including birds, mammals, fishes, reptiles, invertebrates, and plants. And today's program, we're going to focus on one area specifically, and that's birds. And with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close out the screen. I'm going to bring up this 10-minute video, which I think you're going to enjoy.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us for an overview of birds and artificial light at night. I'm Connie Sanchez, Program Coordinator for Bird-Friendly Buildings at National Audubon Society.
And welcome. My name is John Roden. I'm the Senior Director for Bird-Friendly Communities at the National Audubon Society.
John and I are both part of Audubon's Bird Friendly Communities team. So what do we mean by bird friendly communities? With our bird friendly communities efforts, we're seeking to provide food, shelter, safe passage, and places to raise young in the communities we share with birds across the country. Today, we'll be focusing on the safe passage aspect of this work, and in particular, the way that artificial night light affects our native bird species. John?
Thanks, Connie. So why is this an issue? So this satellite image gives an overall impression of the amount of light that's emitted at night across the United States. And if you think about it, this is a phenomenon that's only been in existence for about the past 150 years when we had the ability to actually beam light into the night sky. It's grown massively since then, and it continues to grow. And why does this matter to birds? So if we look at birds across the globe, about 19% are migratory. However, if we drill into North America, about 70% of the species that live in North America are migratory. And if we think about those migratory or those North American species, about 80% of those migrate at night. We think there are a few reasons for this. So migratory flight is obviously very energetically expensive, and it's actually cooler at night. So it may help keep birds cooler as they're making their migratory flights. They can also avoid flying at the same time as the birds that prey on them, since raptors generally migrate during the day. And also there's an additional resource for them to use to navigate by. That's the star map and the moon. And now these are navigational aids that have been present during their evolutionary history. Increasingly, they are getting obscured by all the light we're pumping into the sky, which is what we're talking about today. So how do we understand how birds are moving across the landscape at night when we can't necessarily see them? So one way to do that is with the use of radar. There are a network of 143 stations across the country that help us quantify the number of birds that are traveling across that landscape. So this image on the lower right shows what those radar images look like at these stations. So you can see that there's this concentration across the middle part of the country, and what that translates to is millions of birds traveling. And this happened to be on a night in April of 2017, where looking over time at what we can infer from these data, we can tell that up to 178 million birds were actually traveling, many of them through that central flyway across the middle part of the continent. Okay, so there's been a number of years, about 20 years, that people have been looking at this kind of information. And what we've learned is that billions of birds are actually moving across this landscape during fall migration and spring migration. So you can see that birds will be flying from the south, entering the US, and some large number still continuing on up into Canada in the spring. In the fall, the numbers are augmented by those baby birds that are produced by the breeding birds. And you can see that at the end of the day, over 4 billion birds are leaving the North American airspace during fall migration. It's a really massive, massive phenomenon. Now, the birds that are migrating face a number of challenges, and this slide shows what the built environment, how challenging that can be for them, and the risks to mortality for all of these structures across the landscape. During this presentation, again, we're really focusing on the impact of light, and we do really want to share some recent research that's helped us identify where we should focus our efforts to address artificial light at night to help migratory birds. So this slide shows a synthesis of data from a paper that was published in 2016, which shows that the top 125 cities in the country account for a very small amount of the landmass. But if you think back to the slide at the beginning of the presentation, they actually are broadcasting an immense amount of light into the atmosphere and account for 35.4% of the light reflectance across that landscape. But about half of the United States actually experiences light polluted nights. So more recently, there was a paper that was published last year which looked at the data on these 125 cities and looked at the amount of birds that were flying through reflected in that radar data and then overlaid that on the light emitted from these cities. And the authors use that to calculate an exposure index. So it actually is showing where birds are most exposed, at most risk of seeing artificial light at night, so that we can help pinpoint our activities where, if we do lights out activities, we can help them the most. So I'm going to show you this slide now. It's a little bit busy, so I wouldn't focus so much on the left-hand side of the slide, but more on the right-hand slide. So what this graph has is its fall rank with increasing exposure risk toward the right on the x-axis. On the y-axis, it's the spring rate with increasing exposure to the top. And what you can see is up here at this, the upper right corner, which is blown out here on the far right of the slide, is the cities that have the most risk both in spring and fall. And there's some interesting culprits here again in the middle of the country, Chicago being the #1 risk city for birds in spring and fall. And so that's again a combination of the fact that so many birds are traveling through that area, plus it's emitting a tremendous amount of light. But you can see there's a number of cities here on these axes that are problematic for birds. Okay, I'm going to hand it back to Connie to talk about lights out programs.
Thanks, John. So now, based on what we know, how do we address this issue that artificial light at night presents to birds? We've got Audubon's Lights Out program, a national effort that involves various partners across the Audubon network across the country. And these programs are focusing on raising awareness of the issue, engaging communities in taking action, and advocating for solutions to help. Audubon chapters, centers, state offices, they're all working with building owners and managers to turn off excess lighting during the months that migrating birds are flying overhead. And we're helping to provide them with safe passage between their nesting and their wintering grounds. So turning off bright lights helps birds move on within minutes. And this was discovered by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and New York City Audubon during the annual 9/11 memorial in New York City. Now, hundreds of birds are caught in the memorial's beams every year, but turning them off for just 20 to 30 minutes at a time greatly reduces the density of birds in the area. So taking more steps like this to decrease the amount of light our buildings emit really minimizes unnecessary bird deaths and can also save money by reducing energy consumption. A little bit more about the history of lights out efforts in the national network involved. The Fatal Light Awareness Program in Toronto was the first to raise awareness of the problem that lights pose for birds in an urban center starting in 1993. And in 1999, Audubon and partners established the first Lights Out program in Chicago. Now, since then, groups in many other cities have organized programs to make a difference for birds. You'll see here on the map, the yellow circles on this map show where Lights Out programs include partnerships with International Dark Sky Association. So they're working together in those areas. And you'll be hearing some more about these local efforts and collaborations in the St. Louis area focused on birds and light in a continuation of this presentation from our friends at IDA Missouri, Audubon Center at Riverlands, and the St. Louis Audubon Society. Now, a number of jurisdictions around the country have pursued efforts to address light pollution, and policy change is increasingly a focus of our collective Audubon efforts. Now, what can you do to help? Explore more about our Lights Out activities online. On our Bird Friendly Communities site. Learn about the specific actions you can take for not just Lights Out, but as well as other Bird Friendly Communities programs. And connect with your local Audubon chapter, center, or state office to see how you can get involved in these activities and more. So stay tuned for more information about what's happening locally and reach out to us with any questions regarding bird-friendly buildings and Lights Out. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, folks, what we're going to do now is we're going to switch over to, let's close this out, to our local team. And I do want to make sure, I got a couple of comments that some folks were not necessarily hearing the audio. And before we go too far, I want to make sure that you can hear the audio. Somebody on the Zoom webinar, if you could just let me know that if you're able to hear us, that would be appreciated. Just put it in the chat box that you can hear us for somebody. Would be great. Whoops. Okay, yeah, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so with that, we're going to turn it over to our local team. And I guess, Emily, you want to get started?
Great, thanks, Don. So as Connie mentioned, let's take a closer look at what birds and light are doing here along the Mississippi Flyway, specifically in the St. Louis region. And so this presentation was made possible through the collaboration of these three organizations. So I wanted to recognize St. Louis Audubon Society. We have Jean Favara joining us today. And then the Audubon Center at Riverlands will be joining myself, Emily Connor, as well as the International Dark Sky Association Missouri chapter with Dawn. So the Mississippi Flyway is a really significant flyway. It's one of the largest migratory pathways that we have in North America. And so ranging from Manitoba and Ontario and Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, it has a very large area. And so while most of the other flyways that we have in North America are commonly obstructed by mountain ranges or oceans, this unobstructed flyway is used by actually 60% of all North American songbirds and 40% of North American waterfowl. And so that's encompassing, around 325 different species of birds out of the 900 plus species that can be found in the US. Could you mind going back one? Thanks. And so one of the Mississippi Flyway's greatest resources is that we have the Missouri and Mississippi River Confluence, which happens to be at the heart of the St. Louis region, where you can see that star right here. And so migratory birds will often use these waterways as a roadmap or even like a highway as they're traveling, as they're migrating north and south through their breeding and wintering grounds. And so these rivers are really providing these ample resources that birds really rely on. And if you see the green kind of outline states here, that's representing our Mississippi Flyway. So that encompasses about 14 of our 50 states. So again, it's very large. And for some perspective, to the right, we have our Atlantic Flyway. In the center, we have our Central Flyway, and to the left, we have the Pacific. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at some birds that we do have migrating along the Mississippi Flyway. And it's important to know that birds can be categorized into different types of migrants. And so our first one is our residential migrators. And these are birds that are typically going to stay in the same area. So they'll stay in the same type of habitat year round. Another type could be our long distance migrators. And a really great example of that is our Baltimore Oriole. And so this is one of our summer residents that we get in the St. Louis region, and they'll commonly nest here. They will typically use the Mississippi Flyway as they're migrating south to Central and South America in the wintertime. So that's quite a long distance. Next slide, please. So on the other hand, from our long distance migrators, we can also have our short distant migrants. And I think a good example of that is our osprey. Now ospreys will spend their summer in the St. Louis region and nest here. But when it's time to leave for the winter, they're going to be traveling along the Mississippi River. Ospreys love to stay near large bodies of water, and they're going to spend that winter time in the southern US states along the Gulf Coast. So that's definitely a little bit of a shorter distance compared to our Baltimore Oriole. Next slide. So when are birds really migrating? Most birds actually do migrate at night whenever they're traveling to those wintering or breeding grounds. And as you look in the graphic on the right-hand side here, you can see the Mississippi Flyway has the highest migration activity in the spring compared to anywhere else. And actually has one of the highest in the fall. It's just a little bit more spread out. So if you look at these graphics, that yellow is really representing that high activity for bird migration, and blue is just a little bit less so. Next, please. So however, thank you. So however, light pollution given off, in the St. Louis city and our urban centers, our residential areas can be really disorienting to birds as they're traveling at night to get to those breeding or overwintering grounds and vice versa. And so what typically can happen is this can cause the bird to become overexhausted and can cause them to collide into buildings. And unfortunately, St. Louis is currently the 5th most dangerous city for spring migrants and the 6th most dangerous for our fall migrants. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jean Favara from the St. Louis Audubon Society, and she's going to give us a sneak peek at what they've been doing in the St. Louis region.
Thank you, Emily. This is Jean talking for St. Louis Audubon Society, and I will talk to you about 2 things tonight. A little bit about what St. Louis Audubon Society has done with a major partner, the Gateway Arch National Park, and this was in the past. And then my next slide will talk a little bit more about what we're going to be doing in the future to help birds migrate safely. And you can see in this slide on the left side, you see a nice, beautiful nighttime photo of our Gateway Arch. And in this slide, you can see that the arch is lit up by some outside spotlights, and it does look very beautiful in our St. Louis skyline. However, these type of spotlights can be confusing to birds as they migrate. They inhibit the bird's ability to see the night sky, and they can cause them to exhaust themselves and collide with structures in the area. So back in the early 2000s, St. Louis Audubon Society worked with the National Park Service to try to minimize the effects of the spotlighting of the arch. And then since 2002, the Gateway Arch Park agreed to turn off outside spotlights during the 2 critical migration periods. One was the spring migration period from May 1st to May 15th, and this is a period in St. Louis that tends to cover our most busy night migration period for our local songbird migrators. And then they also agreed to shut down during the fall migration period. Now, fall migration tends to be a much more extended period. However, we felt that the last 2 weeks of September would capture most of our birds as they migrate in the fall. Next slide, please. And you might ask, so what are you doing now? That was back in early 2000. Just this year, in 2020, we have initiated a new project, which we're calling Birds Safe St. Louis. And this project is working to establish long-term community relationships that will support bird-safe practices and reduce bird fatalities due to light pollution and window or building collisions. This project is going to be built on St. Louis Chamber of Arts Council's Silent Sky Lights Out program, as well as the previous St. Louis Audubon Society work that was avian mortality surveys that were done in the early 2000s that I just talked to you about. And what we'd like to do is we're going to initiate avian mortality surveys in the downtown area of St. Louis this fall 2020. And that will help us identify areas with the highest bird mortality. And we want to work with collaboratively with organizations and businesses in those areas to mitigate and reduce bird fatalities, to help our feathered friends have positive and no death during migration events. And I thank you for listening for my 2 slides, and I would like to turn this over to Don again to tell you what you could do to help prevent light pollution in our skies.
Well, thank you, Jane, and thank you, Emily. Obviously, you don't have to be the Gateway Arch to make a difference on light pollution, whether it's to birds or to life around you. And in the IDA world, International Dark Sky world, we talk about what's called the 4 Ps, and it's called the proper place, the proper amount, the proper time, and the proper spectrum, as you see on the right-hand side. In other words, it's how do you use light? How you use light makes a big difference on how much light pollution that you really have. For example, a very common kind of thing, you can see this with street lights on the left-hand side. We've drawn a red line, and anything below that red line is typically useful light. Anything above that red line is simply wasted light. And it's wasted light not only in the sense that it's shining up the sky, but frankly, it's wasting energy as well. So if you look on the right-hand side, What we don't want to do is where the little X is, where we're shining things up with a light fixture like that, whereas you do what's called stop it down. In other words, only point it down, which is the check mark. You'll get more efficient and more effective lighting. The technology is improved so much in the last couple of years. We know that with our smartphones and other types of things. The timers, there's dimmers, there's photocells. Why do you need to light something up when you don't need to light it up? If you have a car driving up and you want to have light, let the light come on, but it can turn off directly after that. If you don't need light all night, you don't need light all night. If you don't need it as bright, you can use dimmers to make that happen. These are pretty cost-effective ways to actually make a big difference in the amount of light. We love LEDs at the International Dark Sky. The trick is that if you get the wrong kind of LED, the kind that gets into the brighter spectrum of, say, blue light, what happens is it actually starts impacting how life on Earth works. We may only see a narrow spectrum of light, but animals and plants see a much broader spectrum. So we encourage you to select the proper spectrum. And for example, if you take a series of light bulbs where on the left-hand side is what they call 1,000 Kelvin, and then you move all the way over to the right-hand side where they have 10,000 Kelvin, we've drawn a red line, and what we're suggesting is you get lights that are 3,000 Kelvin or below. And so how do you do that? Well, if you, say, buy a bulb, this is very typical of the lighting facts that you can find. You have to sometimes look on the actual box, but you usually will find it on most lights. And if you look right here, you're going to see a little bar that says warm on one side and cool on the other. So look for something, in this case it's 2700 K, which is 2700 Kelvin. That would be a good light to get in the sense that it's the right spectrum. But once you get above the 3000 Kelvin, it gets into bright blue lights, and who likes all that kind of stuff to look at all the time? If you happen to shop for new light fixtures, a lot of the places will have dark sky approved fixtures. You can see those on the right hand side. They typically will show the light down. And of course, you've got to get the correct bulbs in them to make them really work. But there are IDA dark sky approved lights that are typically in various hardware stores that you can look for. A really interesting thing that was recently launched by IDA, you can find this at darkskymissouri.org/home lighting, is a self-certification program that you could do at home. You can look at your home, look at your lights against the checklist, and figure out if you're IDA compliant. There's even spreadsheets that we can provide you that can determine how much less light that you're using, so how much money that you can actually save. These are all available. It's just a newly launched program. We'd love to talk with you in terms of how that might work with your home. We have a lot of resources, darkskymissouri.org/lightsout. There's a lot of things you can look up just fine about what's going on to give you more history about this. A lot of research that, for example, we're talking about the 5th and the 6th largest dangerous city. There's research that we can link you to, and we'd love to hear from you guys. We've got all the presenters on this page. This is our websites, and if you go to that other resource. And what we want to do now is we want to move to a Q&A period. This will be a little tricky for us. Now, remember, if you're on Facebook, you should be able to type comments, and Emily's shaking her head. She's starting to see the comments, and she's going to narrate a little bit. And we have the presenters here, and we'd like to be able to answer your questions. And then once we're done with this, which will be not too much longer, we're going to move into our second presentation, which will be a virtual stargazing presentation. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm seeing somewhat kind of clouds and somewhat clear skies. We'll see what happens. See if we can do a live stream of the videos or not. Okay, Emily, what you got?
All right, thanks, Don. So I think we're still waiting for some questions to come in on Facebook. So again, there is a little bit of a delay. So if you guys do have questions, just post them in there and we should have some time to answer them for you. We're also going to take a moment to check any questions we might have coming in on our Zoom, see if we can have any to answer. And it looks like some people were having issue with audio, but I will say that this video will be posted on Facebook and you can watch it later next week or tomorrow if you want. And so if you are having issues with that audio, you will have access to that after the fact.
Yeah, we're having a few issues with it. I see we have some folks coming in from Pittsburgh, Kansas, from around, so that's really great. All right.
All right, so it looks like we do have a question, and so I'll read it off for you guys. It says, how many streetlights in St. Louis are correctly aimed down so that they are not wasted? Don, do you know anything about specifically in St. Louis?
Well, we're still learning about that. I did talk with the Amarin, and they are actually making changes over a course of 5 years. And when I talked to them, which was 3 or 4 years in the program, they said they still had several years of program of changes to make. That is something I don't know the answer to yet, and we are working on learning about that. But it's not just also, by the way, about stopping down. It's also about getting the brightness, the correct too. So we have to make sure they're not actually too bright.
All right. We have another one from Joan, and it says, are there any cooperative efforts with St. Louis County or the Army Corps of Engineers regarding reducing light pollution?
Again, I can't answer that yet because we're a new chapter and we're still reaching out to those. I will know that, I do know that we are starting to reach out to cities. A lot of cities are making some progress. They're actually, in fact, we just joined on our board a city councilman from the city of Ellisville, and they've been making some light pollution ordinances. And what I understand is that, there's homes that are one thing, but also commercial is a pretty big piece of what's going on as far as lights. In other words, a commercial business, because of just the number of lights involved, can really brighten things up pretty quickly. And homes are obviously, when you take a little bit of a home here and a little bit of a home there, pretty soon it's a fairly significant contribution. That said, I've been president of the IDA Missouri for about 1.5 years, and I would say the most common call we get are one of two types. One is my neighbors shining their lights in my house. What can I do? And secondly, if I have some kind of business that's going near me and I'm worried about the bright lights and what recourses do I have? And we of course suggest taking a friendly approach to really resolve that. And IDA at the darksky.org has a lot of resources about how to deal with neighbors and also how to understand light pollution. And by the way, if you've not checked out darkskymissouri.org, we have really some terrific projects going on, which is measuring light. And we're hoping to take what we have right now, which is this great collaboration of Lights Out, and take that throughout the state, talking to Kansas City and other cities to make this a statewide kind of thing, so it really has significant impact to birds across the spectrum, if you will. We have any more questions coming up here?
Yeah, we have lots of questions coming in. So
okay, what you got?
Buckle up. All right, so this one's for Jean. And the question is, how long do birds migrate in the night? Is there a specific time or time frame that these birds are migrating?
So it really depends on the bird species. Many of our birds are taking off shortly after nightfall, and they can migrate all night into the next morning. And generally they will come down at first light or before first light. And one of the first things they're doing is feeding. So you can imagine that migration requires a lot of energy. So they have to restore their energy levels as they continue to migrate either north or south. So it can be pretty much an all-night phenomenon, starting shortly after nightfall. And in fact, one of the older ways to look at the volume of migration, speaking of the night sky, was they would often look at a night with a full moon with a scope, and they would literally try to count birds that were flying across that full moon at night. And that was one of the early ways they would look at migration levels at night.
Thanks, Jean. All right, we have another one. It looks like this one will be for Don. And so somebody wants to just double check, and they're asking what light bulbs within the house should be used. So is there a specific light bulb that should be used for the exterior of your house, or the interior rather?
Yeah, so there's definitely a difference between interior lights and exterior lights. Now, having said that, if a light is on and very bright and you have your blinds open and the light's literally shining out the window, it does affect the life around your house to some degree. But we're really probably more concerned about the exterior lights. Inside the house, I don't know that it's so much about light pollution, but think about this, is I've learned about how humans are impacted by blue light. If you have the brightest lights on that are in the blue spectrum and you go to bed, it takes a while for your melatonin to really kick in. So you got to be thinking about how, in fact, I've literally started dimming my lights down as it gets closer to bedtime, because by the time I get to bed, I want the lights dim so my melatonin is easier to kick in. When you get outside, you really want to be thinking about how much light you really have and what spectrums you have, because literally if you're lighting up, I actually learned this one interesting fact recently, is that if you get above a first quarter moon, lightning bugs don't like the light. And so it shows you how sensitive that nature really is around that.
Wow. All right. Thanks, Don. And it looks like we have about 5 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to keep on moving through. The next one is a question from Don, and it is, are the ideal times for the arch lights to be turned off shifting with climate change?
Well, I think that's almost even an Audubon Society, but I will say this much is that when I've talked with the folks at the Audubon, it's a fairly wide range when they're kind of kicking up and leaving this. So I think we're picking a fairly small range to work with. So Jean, can you maybe answer that? That's probably a better question for you about how wide's the spectrum of actual migration as far as the time?
So as I said earlier, birds will start moving shortly after nightfall, shortly after it gets dark. So having the lights off after dark would be the optimal way or the optimal time period.
I'm thinking they're thinking more like the time of year, though. In other words, which 2 weeks do you pick or 4 weeks do you pick?
Okay.
That's probably, I think, what they're...
Yeah, as far as spring migration in this area, in St. Louis area, our peak tends to be somewhere between May 1st and May 15th. As far as the peak volume of birds, they're migrating. This fall migration is much more spread out. And you can imagine in spring, birds have got somewhere to go and they've got things to do, like raise their kids and get on their territories and find a mate. So that tends to be a much more focused migration period. They're trying to get to those breeding grounds and get going. In the fall, they have finished raising their young and they're more driven by weather events and they don't have to necessarily rush as much to get down south and to their wintering grounds. So it tends to be much more spread out. So it's more of a challenge in the fall to figure out what period is the peak, and it depends on your species of bird. For the case of arch, gateway arch, it was decided the last 2 weeks of September was probably the most reasonable compromise to catch most of the birds. But really, birds can start migrating as early as the end of July, depending on the species, and going all the way with some of our shorebirds to the end of October. So there's a much wider time period for that.
And I'm guessing it's probably shifting very slightly as the climate warms up a little bit. They might be migrating slightly different times, but probably not that noticeable as far as any 10 or 20 year period.
Correct. As far as I know, there's not been any scientific recent publications looking at directly the effects of climate change on migration. Generally, migration is driven by light period. So that's not necessarily, it's not going to change in response to climate. So other things will, where the resources are going to be available as far as where their food, when their food is available will change in response. When the insects appear, will change in response to climate change. And one of the questions has been, as the spring gets warmer quicker, is the peak range of insects going to be matched when the birds actually appear? There's already data to show that that peak is occurring earlier and earlier. And will birds adapt so that they are arriving at the correct time, but their insect food is at their peak? That's still, some birds are not, and some birds are. So that's going to be something we're going to find out in the future.
So there's a question on the Zoom side about is there anything that can be done about the baseball stadium lights, or is that not as problematic as the arch? I think there's probably a general question about lights, and I think if you get something very bright, that's not good to start with. It's not good for a short time. But if you turn lights on and you have a bright baseball field for a period and you turn them off, that's not the same thing as keeping on lights all the time. I think that's a much bigger, broad question in terms of that goes. So I know that they've got a program downtown to brighten up the streets during baseball times to make things safer, which, by the way, is not necessarily a true fact. It is actually safer. If it was bright cities, lights were safer, New York could be the safest place in the world. But on the other hand, if you bring it back down after a fairly short time, then that's not going to have as much long-term impact as others. And I see also about, I'm not sure if you guys know this, Emily or Jean, about how birds are sensitive to different wavelengths, colors of light, and to color temperature of the light source. Do you know have any idea how birds react to light? And I probably could look that up on the research here, but I don't have that.
So there is some research, especially when you talk about outside lighting of buildings. There is some research to suggest that if you have an outside lit building using spotlights, that blue or green lighting is better than white light. That is currently known. So I know, for example, in some of the lights out campaigns and some of the work we will do with downtown businesses, if we do find a building that is spotlight at night, especially spotlights pointing up to the sky, as Don has mentioned, anything that's shielded above, so it's pointing down, is probably not a problem, but anything that's pointed up to the sky, one way to mitigate that would be to switch that to a blue or green light versus a white light.
Okay, I think we're about ready to wrap. Is anything, Emily, do we have much more on the other side there? I think we need to probably wrap up here.
Yeah, it looks like that's a good point to wrap up.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, all the team here, for responding to the questions, and thank you everybody else for participating tonight. So now we're going to switch gears. We're going to move to a virtual stargazing. I'm still looking outside. I can't see through my window because I'm inside to see whether it's really cloudy or not. But I'm going to turn it over to Rich Pfefferman, and I'm going to close that right now. And Rich, if you want to go ahead and try to share the screen now that you can take over, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ranger Richard, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself to start with. I go way back. I can remember the moon landings. In fact, that's what got me into astronomy. But I've also had a parallel interest in history, and so I was hired as a seasonal park ranger at the Arch way back in 1988, and then as a permanent in '89. So I go back a good while. But the park has been very supportive of my interest in astronomy, and in the year 2009, they sent me to a Sky Ranger workshop at Bryce Canyon in Utah. And they told us a lot about their great astronomy program that they have at Bryce Canyon. And I thought, hey, we could bring something like that to the Arch. Of course, we don't have anywhere near the dark sky that Bryce Canyon does. Probably at most only about 100 or 150 stars ever visible at one time. But to a lesser extent, we could see what we can. A lot of brighter objects in the sky make it through the city lights, so you could see more than you think. So in 2010, the Gateway to the Stars program was born, and this is the 11th season that we've been presenting it. Now this year, we've been had to change our gears quite a bit because, of course, with the COVID-19 conditions, we can't have large public gatherings. So for at least the first couple of our monthly events this year, we're going to have virtual astronomy. But with the Stellarium program, I can simulate the night sky very well. I'll give you a tour of the night sky for the next half hour or so. It has the ability to simulate a telescope view as well. And then, knock wood, if it's clear enough at about 9:15, we hope to cut away to Mr. Mark Jones, a member of the St. Louis Astronomical Society, as well as and I am as well. And we hope to do some live viewing of the moon. No guarantees about that. Depends on the skies out in West County and technology. Also, a little teaser for you. You probably heard, most of you, about the launch that happened today, and there will be a chance to see Crew Dragon later this evening if the weather cooperates, and I'll get to that later. So without further ado, we will give this program a try. And right now, of course, it's still pretty light outside. The sun set only about a half hour ago, and the Stellarium program is set for the latitude and longitude of Gateway Arch National Park. And right now, it would probably be too light to see much of anything other than the moon. So our first object we'll be looking at tonight is the moon. And we'll scroll in and get a good look at it. Now, of course, to the naked eye, the moon looks a bit like this tonight. It's just barely over half full. You can make out the dark features, which are called maria. They're lava plains on the moon. When the moon is completely full, a lot of people think it looks like a man on the moon, or some say a lady reading a book, depending on what angle you look at it. But this would probably be about how the moon looks like to the unaided eye. We could scroll in some more, and now might be a bit more of a binocular type view. And you see the maria, the lava plains, and then you also start seeing a lot of craters along the Terminator, which is the line between the light and dark sides. Now, tonight would actually be a great night to look at the moon if you happen to have binoculars or a telescope at home, because people think full moon is the best, but you actually see the best crater detail when the moon is not close to full, because you have these nice shadows that define the terrain. Finally, if you scroll to a telescope type view now, much more magnified, you see a whole lot more. And I'll identify some of the features for you. This round one here is the Sea of Crises, the Mare Crisium right there. And then you have sort of three Maria all together here. And the one in the middle is the Mare Tranquillitatis, or the Sea of Tranquility, very famous due to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And right about here would be the location of the Apollo 11 moon landing. And one of the common questions I get is, can you see the flag, or see the lunar module, or see their footprints? And unfortunately, the Earth's atmosphere and optics don't allow it. Even with the Hubble Space Telescope, the smallest thing you could see is about 300 feet across. And the lunar module, which is the largest thing they left behind, is only about 18 feet across. So we can't come close to seeing the actual moon landing objects, but you could see right where they landed with a decent telescope. Now, a few years ago, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, about 15 miles above the moon, was able to actually resolve the landers, even the astronauts' footprints, and in a couple of the Apollo missions, the flag. And that's really amazing that they could do that. But once again, they're orbiting only about 15 miles above the moon. So some nice features to see. Finally, we'll scroll back a little bit to see the bottom of the moon, the northern part, and you could see all of these craters, a very heavily cratered terrain. It's called Terra, and this is where many, many meteorite impacts occurred long ago, early in the moon's history. That doesn't mean that there weren't meteor impacts up in the lava plain areas. It just means that the lava erased the craters that used to be there. So you could learn quite a bit of the geology of the moon on a great night to look at it like this. So we would spend probably a good while looking at the moon tonight. Certainly it's a very impressive object to see. Now, what we'll do now is to turn our sights to the western horizon, and I'll just walk us over there. And as the screen shows, it's still quite light outside, but this gives us our chance to see the only planet of the evening, except for one little problem. And that's a problem that all stargazers have to deal with, and that is, other than the lens being on the telescope, which everybody's done sometimes. The problem is that there could be a house or a building, or in the case of the arch, lots of city buildings in the way. So we're going to pretend that we would be lucky enough that the planet Mercury would be able to sneak in right between two of the buildings, or we're just going to take a little liberty and erase those trees like this. And so now you see the western horizon is the line over here between the west and northwest there. And so out that way, you can see one little star in the western sky, and we'll see what that is at this time of night. It is the planet Mercury, and this is a great chance to see Mercury for about the next week or so. Look, as this shows, a low in the west, just a little bit north of west, about 9 o'clock or so. It looks like a little shy pinkish star. And if you do see Mercury, and you're pretty good company, because it's not in good position to see very often. As you know, Mercury is the closest planet to the sun, so it's often too close to be seen, but we have a good chance right now, kind of just glowing all by itself out there, a little dim pinkish star usually it looks like. Now, if you put a telescope on it, unfortunately it's a challenging object, because when you look at an object low in the sky, you're looking through all the various air masses of Earth's atmosphere. So objects looking low in the sky like Mercury tend to shimmer and shake and look blurry. But with the stellarium, let's see what we can do with Mercury there. I do need to center it, so there you go. Now Mercury is going to pass in between the Earth and Sun in a couple of weeks, so it'll look like a crescent and then a new phase. Right now, it looks kind of like a thick crescent, if you see it right there, between crescent and half full. It does not show up very well in a telescope because, again, you're looking through all of those air masses. But sometime in the next week or so, if it's clear, look for Mercury shining out there, and it's definitely the hardest planet to see with the unaided eye. Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are much easier to see, and we'll talk about some of them later. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit more now, and this is really going completely illegal. I'm going to move up Mercury. First, let me zoom out a little bit here. Back to our view before, and we're going to break all protocols because now we're looking below the horizon. So here's the horizon right here, and if you do that, we should be able to make out the planet Venus, which is, there it is right there. Again, it's actually below the horizon. We were able to see it through the fall, winter, and early spring, but now Venus is so close to the sun that you really can no longer see it in the sun's glare. It's going to pass between the Earth and Sun in just a few days, and if you could see it, it would look like an extremely thin crescent. But no Venus anymore. Unfortunately, it's lost to view. All right, we'll bring our horizon back now. There we go. Now, as it gets just a little bit darker, probably I'm going to scroll ahead a little bit in time. And this is great. I can move back in time. I can move ahead in time. This program is like a time machine. It's a lot of fun to play with. And we're going to make the stars move maybe just a little faster than that right there. And you could see an interesting star formation. So right now it's showing about 9:15 tonight. And there's an interesting group of stars that can be seen. And I recently saw it given a name, which of course I like, the Arch of Spring. And we could see that at this time of year. Let me see if I can scroll in just a little bit more. There we go, get that last star name in there. You would start with Pollux and Castor, the Gemini twins, which will be about halfway up in the west at this time of year. And they would sort of be the keystone of the Arch of Spring. And then to the left, the south leg of the arch would go from Procyon to Pollux. And then the north leg would go from Castor to two more stars, Menkalan and Capella. And I may be not doing these Arabic pronunciations quite right. But if you put all that together, and I'll scroll out just a little bit, you have a pretty good Arch of Spring, a lot flatter than the Gateway Arch, but it's out there in the sky, and you can see it any clear night, probably for about another week or so. They're getting lower in the sky. They'll be, especially Procyon and Capella, will start being lost in the sun's glare pretty soon. So the Arch of Spring, actually these stars were at the highest in the winter sky, but they kind of shine all by themselves now at this time of year. So the Arch of Spring. We're going to turn our attention as it's gradually getting darker to the north. And a very famous star group we're going to see. And this is none other than the Big Dipper. Now, the Big Dipper, if you live in bright city lights, it's sometimes hard to see the star that joins the bowl and the handle. That's a bit dimmer than the others, but you should be able to make out the 4 stars, or at least 3 that make up the bowl, and then the 3 that form the handle. And of course, you know probably that the Big Dipper stars are part of a much larger constellation, Ursa Major, the Great Bear. And so for just a second, I'll turn the constellation lines back on, and you could see that Ursa Major, with all these other projections, does not look a whole lot like a bear. I guess those are supposed to be the claws, and then maybe the end of the Dipper's handle is the nose, but you got to reach pretty hard to make a bear out of the Ursa Major. However, you could use the Big Dipper to locate many other objects in the sky. The 2 stars in the bowl that are farthest from the handle, if you draw a line from them, they always point to Polaris, the North Star. And Polaris is really special because it happens to be located directly above the Earth's axis. If you drew a line from the center of the Earth through the North Pole out into space, it would point very close to the North Star. Now, it hasn't always been the North Star, Polaris has. It does change over a 25,000-year period. But right now, we're lucky to have a fairly bright star near the North Pole of the sky. I've been down in the southern hemisphere a couple of times. The Southern Cross happens to point to the South Pole, but there is no bright star. In fact, what you might call the South Star is barely even visible to the unaided eye. So we have the edge over the Southern Hemisphere in that regard. Now, Polaris is at the end of the handle of the Little Dipper, but unfortunately, the stars of the Little Dipper are a whole lot fainter, and probably from near the city, you'll only see these 2 stars in the bowl of the Little Dipper, but you can see the whole thing if you go out in the country. By the way, a useful tip you could use to locate more things would be to use binoculars like these. Good 7 or 10 power binoculars can come in handy to locate dim objects, maybe pick up Mercury in the twilight if you're having trouble spotting it. And also even stars, parts of constellations that are too dim to see with the city lights, and of course watching lots of birds. Binoculars are a great thing. Perhaps you already have them at home. Another useful tool would be a flashlight if you're using a paper star map. Of course, a bright white light like this is quite bright, but a red light is better because it would not ruin your adaptation to the night sky. So if you're using a paper star map of some kind, a red flashlight. And one way to make that is to simply put some red nail polish over a small, cheap, regular flashlight. Now, the Big Dipper can be used for more things, to locate more objects. And one of the things you can do is to follow the arc of the Big Dipper's handle to the bright star Arcturus, which is high in the southeast at this time of year, and then continue or speed on to another bright star, Spica. And the way I was always taught that was you arc to Arcturus and then speed on to Spica from the Big Dipper's handle. And then you could even continue or curve to the stars of Corvus. Corvus is not a very bright constellation, but you can maybe make out a little square of stars to the lower right of Spica. So arc to Arcturus, speed on or spike to Spica, and continue to Corvus as a way to locate 3 more interesting things in the sky. You also can, as I bring the Big Dipper back there, If you draw, remember, these are our friends, the pointer stars, the two stars that point to the North Star. If you draw the line the other way, it points close to the bright star Regulus, which is near to the moon this evening. Oh, there was a meteor. You would get a meteor every now and then that would appear, and this computer program has it. You might expect to see about one meteor maybe every 10 to 15 minutes or so, especially if you're in a darker sky. But if you draw a line through the pointers, it points down to these stars in the constellation Leo. Now, the stars of Leo are kind of overwhelmed by the bright moon tonight. But if you look closely, perhaps you can make out a bit of a lion if you have some imagination. Regulus is sort of at the end of a backwards question mark of stars. Looks like a sickle, actually. And this could form the lion's head, and then the body, and then the back triangle of stars would be the hindquarters, and then this star marks the tip of the lion's tail. The legs, the paws of the lion are very dim, especially tonight with the moon and the city lights. Maybe you could pretend the lion is crouching in the grass and you can't see his paws. Or if you prefer, we could make, although this is definitely not something you could see in the sky, you could make sky pictures out of all the constellations. And now he definitely does look like a lion, although of course you can't see that in the sky. He even has a baby Leo Minor, a little lion just above him. It's a fun program. Of course, the ancient people had lots of time to make whatever pictures they wanted to out of the stars. They didn't have to contend with city lights. They probably had a lot of time on their hands, and they were able to get draw in a lot of cool constellations. Okay, now we're going to move over to a special event that's happening a little bit later tonight. We're going to return to the northwestern part of the sky. And here's where you might want to either take out a pen and paper or look at the Gateway Arch NPS Facebook page, because I posted this information about an hour and a half ago. But you all probably know that SpaceX launched the Crew Dragon capsule into orbit earlier today at 2:23 this afternoon, and it's on the way to the International Space Station. And it's the first manned American mission that's going to orbit since the space shuttle was retired in 2011. And tonight only would be the chance to see the Crew Dragon heading for the International Space Station, because by tomorrow night, although it's supposed to be clear, it will already be docked to the space station, so you won't be able to see it individually. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge, but go out just a little bit after 10 tonight. Be in position at just about 10:16. And the Crew Dragon will be very faint at first. It's going to appear to the left of the star Capella. This is a view to the northwest, very low in the sky, and it's going to make its way over about a minute and a half. It's going to get brighter and brighter. And right about here, just a little bit to the lower left of the North Star. Remember, there's the Big Dipper, there's the handle. The pointer stars point to the North Star. So a little bit to the lower left of the North Star at just about 10:18 and 20 seconds, the Crew Dragon will be at its brightest. And then just then, it will start fading into the Earth's shadow. So it'll probably only be for 30 seconds or maybe a minute at most that it's going to be visible. So you got to be there just the right time. I hope it's clear. Again, I've posted it to the Gateway Arch NPS Facebook page if you didn't get all the information. But 10:17, 10:18 from the area around Capella, very low in the northwest, getting brighter and ending just a little bit to the lower left of the North Star. It's estimated, nobody knows for sure, because the Crew Dragon has only been tested before. It's estimated that it might be about as bright as the North Star or the stars in the Big Dipper. So fairly bright, but not dazzling. Now, about 6 or 8 minutes later, much brighter will be the International Space Station itself, which of course the Crew Dragon is chasing. And that's going to basically do the same thing. It's going to start in between the Gemini Twins and Capella. In fact, I believe I can simulate this with the program. We'll go ahead a little bit. There it goes. Oh, that was too quick. Did you see it for a second there? We go back. It actually will be visible for about 4 minutes. All right, let's stop there. So here it is coming up right about 10:25. So just a few minutes after the Crew Dragon disappeared. And it's going to slowly make a way. This would be a simulation of real time now. It starts off dim, but it gets brighter and brighter, and it's going to pass right between the pointers and the North Star right about 10:27. Should be really easy to see if the sky is clear. And then it faded out all of a sudden right at 10:28. Now, the computer program has it fading out, but it's not actually that quick. It takes a minute or two to fade out. So the Crew Dragon will be tricky, but you should pretty easily be able to see the International Space Station tonight. Again, starting off low in the northwest, about 10:24 or so, between the Big Dipper and the North Star about 10:27, and then disappearing or fading out in here around 10:28. A pretty cool thing to see. And again, this is the first American mission to orbit, so it's kind of a historic event. Maybe take our minds off of some less happy events that are going on in the world around us right now. Well, I want to show one more thing before we'll try to cut over to Mark. Let's see if we can get it. Head to the eastern sky now. There's south and then east. And this is one for those of you who like to stay up late. And of course, my kids have been on extended break, and they've kind of got into some bad hours, so they might even be up for this. But right now we're set for 10:30, and we're going to move ahead in time and see what happens. We can see a couple of more planets. Here comes one. Here comes the other. Jupiter is really bright, and then Saturn is just to the lower left, and you should be able to see them. This is set for like 12:36, so probably around 12:30 or 1 o'clock, depending on how many trees you have in this direction. You'll be able to see them rising in the southeastern sky. However, if you don't want to stay up that late, they are rising a little bit earlier every day and about an hour and a half earlier each month. So that means 2 months from now, at the end of July, they'll be in this position about 9:30 at night. And so they will get into better and better view. And notice how close together Jupiter and Saturn are. This is less than if you put your hand at arm's length, it's closer than that in the sky, about 5 degrees. And on December 21st this year, Jupiter is going to be 1/10 of a degree. And the moon is 1/2 degree in size. So that's really close. Jupiter is going to pass Saturn this year on December 21st. And this happens every 20 years. We call it a great conjunction. So what can you see on Jupiter? If you scroll in and simulate the binocular view, and let me move it to the middle here. With good binoculars, You can maybe 7 or 10 power binoculars. The first number in your binoculars is the magnification. The second number is how big the lenses are. 7 or 10 power binoculars may show a couple of Jupiter's moons as little dots right next to it. And then as you start getting a small telescope view, you start to pick up a couple of stripes. They look like cloud belts. Stripes, cloud belts is what they actually are, areas of rising and falling gases in Jupiter's atmosphere, and almost like from a game of billiards, you might say, with the two stripes across the middle. Occasionally, if it's facing us, you could see the great red spot on Jupiter if you have a good telescope. So you can see up to 4 moons of Jupiter when it's out in the sky. Not always. They orbit Jupiter, but we see their orbits edge on. So sometimes they appear to go right in front of Jupiter or behind Jupiter. So sometimes you might have 3 on one side, 1 on another, all 4 on the same side, or maybe only 2 or 3 of the moons are visible. So Jupiter, if you stay up late, you can see tonight. And then finally, nearby in the sky would be Saturn. And if you had a popular vote, I think most people would vote for either the moon or Saturn as the most impressive object to see in the night sky. I think I might lean to Saturn, but of course it's a matter of personal preference. Now, Saturn looks much dimmer than Jupiter does in the sky, but still fairly bright. Of course, planets shine by reflected light from the sun, and Saturn, being much farther away, gets much less light, but still plainly visible to the unaided eye. It looks like a pretty bright star. It just gives you an impression of great distance, kind of a dull yellowish color. And if you put a telescope on Saturn, you need probably about 40 power. You start to pick up, coming out of either side, Saturn's rings. This would probably be about a 40 power view. But with a better telescope, you start to see them very well. This would be probably similar to about the best views I've had of Saturn with a telescope. You can see what's called the Cassini division, dividing the rings in 2. Saturn's moon Titan, and some of Saturn's other moons clustered around it. So 2 more planets if you stay up late. And I'm not going to zoom in much on Mars, but I'm just going to rotate the sky the rest of the way for the evening. And we'll see Mars coming up in a little while. Notice the time there. There's going up on 1 o'clock in the morning. 2, 3, and there's Mars. Mars will be about as bright, just slightly brighter than Saturn, and have a reddish orange tint to it. But you can see what the time is, 2:49 in the morning. Could maybe see it by about 2 o'clock. But it too will move into the evening sky in the late summer, and it will be unusually bright and close to Earth in October. So the Stellarium program is a pretty fascinating way to tour the night sky. I hope you have enjoyed the tour, and we'll just simulate the rest of it.
So Rich, we do have a couple of questions. So Rich, we do have a few questions before we maybe move over to Mark, because I think since you got everything up there already.
All right, very good. And then there's the sun rising. All right, so what questions do we have?
Well, we have one question, I think, just clarify. Somebody was asking if Arcturus is the North Star.
Arcturus is not the North Star. The Big Dipper's handle, if you follow the arc of the handle, it points to Arcturus. The 2 stars in the bowl that are farthest from the handle point to Arcturus. And let's see if I can bring it back around to the north to show that. So the 2 stars in the bowl farthest from the handle point to Arcturus. Now at this time of night, the Big Dipper is very low. There it is there, and there would be the bowl stars. If you draw a line from them, they point to Polaris. And then this arc of the Big Dipper's handle would point to Arcturus, Spica, and Corvus. Again, I believe this will be saved to the Missouri IDA, and I hope the Arch Facebook page website as well.
So the next question is, they just wanted you to repeat about, first, the person was asking, did you say Crew Dragon? And also, was that tonight? At what time, again, could they see?
Yes. Crew Dragon is about 10:17, 10:18 tonight, if it clears up. It'll be start very low in the northwest, and then it'll end just to the lower left of the North Star, and hopefully by then it'll be similar brightness. So if it's clear, you should be able to see it if those predictions are accurate.
Okay, I think we might have some time for questions at the end here, but I would like to get maybe to Mark, because Mark, he says it's starting to look pretty good out there. So maybe we can have him stream the moon for a few minutes with the live stream, and we can open it up for some more questions between Mark and yourself and whatever. How's that sound?
Excellent. So I'll stop sharing that.
No, yeah, that's fine. So Mark, if you can go ahead and start taking over the system here, and just bear with us, folks. This is a little tricky. We're moving to an actual telescope, and he's got to do a couple things to make things happen here.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. What you should be seeing right now is a live photo,
Mark,
video.
Mark, if you could talk just a little closer to your mic. We're hearing you, but you're fading in and out just a bit.
Okay. What you're seeing right now is the live video feed of the southern portion of the moon. So you should be seeing a number of circular impact craters peppered up and down the surface of the moon. And we're looking at what's called the Terminator here. This is the shadow line between the day side and the night side of the moon. So right at that shadow line there, where the craters become invisible, that's where the sun is actually rising right now. If you were to follow these craters over the course of the night, you would actually be able to perceive the shadows slowly walking their way across the surface of the floors of some of these craters. Now, right now, you're probably seeing some clouds that are passing between the telescope and the moon. So you might see some weird-looking shadows drifting across. Those are clouds. Well, we've been pretty lucky so far tonight. So we're looking at the southern portion of the moon. The South Pole is at the very bottom there. And an interesting theory is that there is actually water ice at the southern pole of the moon. And this could possibly be a source of water for astronauts and colonists once they establish some kind of base on the moon. I believe NASA plans on doing some more exploration in this area because we can't see into the deep craters near the South Pole. They're pointed away from us, and luckily they're pointed away from the sun. So that means the ice does not melt and evaporate. It would not last very long otherwise. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to, I'm going to move the telescope up more towards the equator of the moon. And now we're almost to the equator of the moon, almost into the northern hemisphere. And they have some really neat looking craters here towards the middle of the view. You might see three rather large craters kind of stuck together. They're kind of stacked on top of each other like an inverse snowman. And I'm going to move those to the center of our video image. Now, the moon has craters, which is something that the Earth really doesn't have very many of. But there are other common features that the moon has with the Earth. There's mountain ranges, there's valleys, and there's even cliffs. And we're going to try to zoom in on a cliff right now that's located just to the left of those three craters. So I'm going to try zooming in on the moon here. So we should be getting a new image popping up here as a new window opens. See if I can get that expanded out. Okay, so this is an expanded view. And I'm going to, so we're looking at a very small portion of it now. Just coming into view are those three craters, that inverse snowman that you see there on the left-hand side of the view. Is everybody seeing that? Don, is that visible? Don and Rich? Hopefully you're seeing those. What I wanted to point out here is this black line that I'll be moving to the center of the video stream. This is a fault or a cliff area on the mountain. Looks like a dark line. It's about 60 miles long. It's only it's not as tall as the arch in height, but at certain times of the lunar month, we can see it cast a shadow. See it cast a sun shadow onto the surface, and that's why we can see it as this dark line. Recenter up here. You'll see the image of the moon go in and out of focus, and that is the atmosphere, the turbulent atmosphere, blurring the moon, and then it'll get sharp for a few, just brief fractions of a second. And astronomers have to compensate for that atmospheric turbulence by using what's called image processing. They'll take many shots of the moon or of a planet, and then they'll throw away all the ones that are affected by the Earth's atmosphere, and only use the ones that are the sharpest. And they have techniques for stacking those together to really make amazing images of the moon and the planets. So I wanted to show you that one. I think it's a really neat feature, and it's visible during this time of the lunar month, just past first quarter. Now let's go ahead and move a little further north. We're now entering into the northern latitudes on the moon, and we'll go ahead and move up to a really nice mountain range. There's a kind of an arc of mountains, and I'm going to try to move those once again to the center of the video image, so we can look at it more closely. Now there's longitude and latitude on the moon, just like on the Earth. And this mountain range has a northern latitude about the same as St. Louis is above the Earth's equator, about 38 degrees north latitude. And I believe these are called the Apennine Mountains. Let's see if, once again, if we can electronically increase our image. Let's see if we can get a picture of that mountain range. See, I'm a little bit too far north. I'm going to move a little bit further south, and we should start to pick up that mountain. So there we start to see it now. So that is, I don't know the height of those mountains. I think some of them might be as high as 10 to 15,000 feet above the surrounding lava plains on the lunar surface. The smooth areas you see on the upper left there, those gray areas, those are lava plains caused by very large impacts into the moon's surface that cause the surface to melt and flow out very smoothly. And then once it's solidified, left behind this very smooth plain. And then later on, additional craters or additional asteroids ran into the lunar surface and created new craters on top of the old lava plains. And that's what you see here, right about the field of view right now. It looks like an oval shape, but that only looks oval because of our perspective. This is the crater Archimedes, but it is circular. Almost all craters are circular, even though they may look oblong shape. That's just our perspective. If I move a little bit further north, we start to see some individual little mountains that are protruding up through the lava plain. So after the lava melted and then flowed across the surface, it looks like it's submerged some of these mountains, leaving behind just some peaks left behind on the surface. I'll go back to our normal view again. Here's our normal view. I'm going to continue just the rest of the way up to the North Pole. And the North Pole is similar to the South Pole in that sunlight never reaches some of the deep craters in the northern region. So there could be water ice either on the surface or directly under the surface of the moon. And this might be water ice that, once again, astronauts can harvest and use. There's a variety of uses. If we don't have to take water to the moon and actually excavate it from the moon's surface, we can use it for drinking, of course, and irrigation. But we can also use it for, we can break it apart into oxygen for breathing. We can also use it for generating electricity. So there's a lot of uses for water if we can get access to it, if we don't have to take it ourselves, to take it on our spaceships to the moon. We can actually harvest it right there. They're doing the same thing on Mars. They're looking for areas where there's subsurface ice, and these areas would be primary locations for astronauts to land, both on the moon and on Mars particularly, so they don't have to carry their own water with them to the moon. All right, well, that's all I've got. Just want to give you a really quick tour of the moon from the South Pole to the North Pole. So I guess we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, so I've got a question here. One of the questions was if the moon was once covered in lava. Was it covered in lava one time?
Ooh, I'm not a lunar specialist or anything like that, but just like the Earth, there must have been a time when the lunar surface must have been almost completely molten, but then quickly certain parts of it, I'm sure, cooled, and other parts remained quite warm for a long period of time. But all this, pretty much the entire surface of the moon has been reworked several times, and what we're seeing is about 3 to 4 billion years worth of impacts and reprocessing of the lunar material. Even the astronauts could see micrometeorite impacts, and all of the dust that the Apollo astronauts kicked up with their feet were caused by micrometeorite impacts on the moon, pulverizing the rocks on the moon and turning them into that very, very fine dust. So it continues to go through processing, but at a much slower rate than it did at its early in its lifetime. Any other questions?
Hang on a second here, Mark. I'm trying to check the Facebook and see in which area did we land.
Ooh, well, we landed about a half a dozen times on the surface of the moon. So, in fact, one of the areas that we landed is pretty close to this shadow region. I don't know if I can get to it or not. See if I can go back to the zoom. The Apollo 11 astronauts and the early missions landed fairly close to the moon's equator. This made it easier for them to land and then lift off again. And then in later missions, they went to higher latitudes. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to that area or not. Let me swing over to the Apollo 11 area. That might be a little bit easier. Now, the sun is very high above the horizon right now at the Apollo 11 landing site. And I've centered the Apollo landing site on the video image. So right about in the center is where the Apollo landing site was. It's best to look at that area of the moon when during sunrise. So before first quarter moon is when that Terminator or sunrise shadow is in this area around the Sea of Tranquillity. And when it's like that, the shadows are more pronounced, and it's just easier to see more detail on the surface of the moon. Buzz Aldrin noted that when he was on the lunar surface and he faced his back to the sun and looked at the lunar soil, that it was very, very bright, very, very bright. And yet when he turned around and faced towards the sun, the soil looked very, very dark, almost like asphalt. And so this reflection of sunlight off of little tiny grains of lunar soil really reduces contrast unless you're near this Terminator, as it's called. You just can see more details. You don't have the harsh, it's almost like what Don was talking about earlier tonight, where you have outdoor lighting that's very harsh. It makes it difficult to see because you don't have the shadows and other things that help you with your depth perception. Instead, you've got a lot of glare, and it makes it very difficult to perceive depth or even motion. So same thing on the moon. It's best to try to look at the moon when you're near this sunrise, sunset point. I'll try to adjust my focus here a little bit. Getting a lot of dancing around by the atmosphere. You can see it jumping up and down.
Mark, we had a question about how big some of the craters are that you're showing.
Well, with this telescope, we can probably see craters down to just a couple of miles in diameter. And I don't know about all of these craters here, but I would imagine that, for instance, this crater that you see in the field of view right now is probably in the 15-mile range, something like that. There are some amazingly large craters on the moon. This one here that's in there right now, the bottom of the snowman again, the inverted snowman, that one is probably 100 miles or close to 100 miles across. And if we keep going further south into the southern lunar highlands, as it's called, very rugged territory, we haven't sent any astronauts to this area. We have a really cool crater called Tycho. This crater right here is Tycho. Well, I may have that. That may not be right. Let me let's go down here. This large crater here is almost 150 miles across. This is the crater Clavius. So you see a large crater, and it actually has several craters on the inside of it. So some of these are quite large. I think the largest craters on the moon that are on the near side of the moon are close to 200 miles across. Those are extreme sizes.
So we have a question. I'm going to spread this around a little bit. Rich, there was a question that kind of came up in the middle of your presentation about magnitude of stars. I know that you were trying to just do a very high level, but how do you find the magnitude of stars? And what does even magnitude mean?
Well, magnitude is a measure of star brightness, and it was originally determined in ancient times. Astronomers like Ptolemy long ago grouped stars into 5 or 6 categories. The 25 or so brightest stars in the skies were lumped together as first magnitude stars. Then the next category down, second magnitude, would be about as bright as the stars in the Big Dipper. Those are stars like that. Then third magnitude would be like the star that joins the candle in the bowl. Fourth magnitude, you start getting where it's hard to see if you're near the city unless it's maybe straight up in the sky. They eventually put a mathematical equation to it where each is about 2.5 times brighter than the one before. And if you do 2.5 times 2.5 times 2.5, a 5 magnitude difference is 100 times in brightness. Sixth magnitude star is the faintest that can be seen to the unaided eye from dark sky locations, but from the arch, we might maybe barely be able to do fourth magnitude on a really clear night with no moon, and sometimes not nearly even that bright. And unfortunately, there's a lot more stars in the dimmer category. So you see a whole lot more stars, of course, from the country than you can from downtown St. Louis or most of the suburbs. So magnitude is a measure of brightness. Some of the very brightest stars, like Sirius, the winter dog star, and some of the planets actually have negative magnitude, -1, -2, and those are, very, very bright. So that's a nutshell for magnitudes. Any other questions?
I'm sorry. Yeah, we had one question about the temperature of the moon. Does anybody know the temperature of the moon? And I know it will wildly vary based on whether it's in darkness or in light, of course, right?
I believe the range is from approximately 200 below zero to 200 above zero, give it or take. That's very approximate, but yes, it's a huge range because the moon has no atmosphere to bring the heat all around. So thus, as soon as the sun sets in a given area, the temperature drops like a rock.
Right. It's almost like Missouri weather sometimes, or Illinois weather, right? Let's see if we have any more questions here. Are there any moon landing simulators? Have you guys seen that? I know there's some really good apps on the moon about the moon, but what about simulators about landing on the moon? Have you guys seen anything like that?
I'm not familiar with that. Mark, if you're still there, are you familiar?
No, I don't know. I'm sure there are. I like to use Google Moon. So anybody that's familiar with Google Earth.
You might repeat that again, Mark. You're coming just a little garbled, at least for a moment.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
All right. I don't know of any lunar simulators. I'm sure there are some out there. I personally use Google Moon. That's affiliated with Google Earth. So if you download that app, and then you can select either the Earth, of course, or Moon, or you can even select Mars. And with that, you can vary your height above the terrain and things like that. And there are some really cool pre-programmed tours that they do through Google Moon, including some of the takeoffs and landings of some of the Apollo flights, and some of the excursions as they walked or drove over the surface of the moon. It's a real good one, narrated by Dr. Harrison Schmitt from Apollo 17, as they tour you around the area of the moon where Apollo 17 landed, and he talked a lot about what they saw at the different points that they stopped and collected rock samples. There's also another one for Apollo 11 that's very good. So if you have access to Google Moon, try that one.
So we had a clarification question. I think I can answer this one. The question was the temperatures that you were quoting, Rich, they were in Fahrenheit, as I recall. I think it's actually mid-200s Fahrenheit all the way to lower 200s Fahrenheit. So it's not Celsius.
Correct.
All right. All right, let's see if we have anything else coming up here on our presentation. Trying to skip through. We're getting a lot of comments here. Sometimes it's just comments, so I'm trying to figure out the comments from the questions. So.
Well, while you look for questions, I'd just like to mention that 4 weeks from tonight, we do have our next program scheduled, Saturday, June 27th. We believe that we'll be able to have Mr. Ken Porter. He is an expert on Lewis and Clark, and he's going to do a program, Finding the Way with Lewis and Clark. That's a little bit tentative at this time, due to the COVID-19 situation, but almost certainly it'll be another online program starting at 8 p.m. And I certainly hope we can get some more of this awesome telescope viewing after that, weather permitting, of course. So June 27th, check the Gateway Arch NPS Facebook page for updates on the schedule. And remember, and now it's about a half hour or so, about 10:17 is the Crew Dragon pass low in the northwestern sky.
And I'd like to make a plug too. The IDA Missouri has got a program coming up on June 16th. If you like to take photographs of the Milky Way, this is something you can visit the darkskymissouri.org Facebook page. And they're going to train you. It'll be free. It's just a webinar by a professional photographer. Does a really good job of teaching you how to take basic photographs of the Milky Way. And that's on June 16th. Check the times on our Facebook page. And on the 19th, the St. Louis Astronomical Society will be actually hosting one of the IDA Missouri board members who will talk about the science of light pollution. We're putting meters up throughout the state. In fact, we just got approval to put 3 sky meters to measure the straight up sky brightness. We got approval from Missouri State Parks to add 3 new meters to the program in Grand Gulf and Echo Bluffs and Thousand Hills. So we'll have a number of meters, and this is the scientists behind that. So I think it'll be a fun thing, particularly if you like science. Rich, it looks like, let's see if we got any more questions coming up here. We're about wrapping up, I think.
Yes. Looks like we have them all. Again, I would like to thank all of you for watching. I think this has been a wonderful program. Hopefully you all learned a lot about both light pollution and finding your way in the night sky. And I want to thank all of our co-hosts and contributors, Mark and Don, and then from the Audubon, St. Louis Audubon and Audubon Riverlands before. I think we've had a wonderful evening tonight.
Yeah, I'd like to equal that. Just a really good job. It was fun. I will tell you, it was a little nerve-wracking at some times here when we're trying to figure out how to make all this technology work. But for the most part, we didn't do just too bad, I hope. So it looks like we had one last question here. It seems as though they would want to study the water on the moon, and the Science Center had an in-person moon rover simulator, which is kind of cool. So I don't know if there's anyone who wants to respond about the studying the water on the moon. We actually have some pretty good Washington University professors working, research people studying those, because we've actually talked to them. It's kind of fun. All right, I think we really probably don't have much more time here. Rich, we're going to wrap up, I guess?
Yes, well, thanks to everyone, and I hope you all have a very good evening. Be safe, and hopefully we'll see you on June 27th for more Gateway to the Stars, and check out the Missouri IDA program on June 16th, and also our other partners tonight, the St. Louis Audubon and the Audubon Riverlands. I'll keep the posts up on the Arch Facebook page about their programs and information. Again, thanks to all of you. You've been a great audience, and have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, and Rich, thank you. You guys have done a wonderful job, National Park Service, and you particularly, Rich. You've been a great supporter of all these different organizations, and we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, folks, we're going to end this, and we hopefully within about an hour or so, we should have recordings out there through Facebook Live, and you can replay it if you want to. Hopefully it worked that way. If not, we'll, I guess, be in trouble. So we'll talk to you later. Thank you very much.